Hidden in the waters off the southern coast of Cuba lie the remains of Spain's mighty warships, lost in a climactic battle of the Spanish-American War. Join the sea hunters as they explore these wrecks and dive the remains of the collier USS Merrimac, the unarmed American coal carrier whose secret mission nearly saved the Spanish squadron from its tragic fate.
The Cuban contracts are signed.
On board a dive ship off Nova Scotia, sea hunter John Davis receives a satellite phone call with good news. After a year's patient negotiations with the Cuban government, the team has been granted permission to dive the wrecks of the Spanish-American War. The sea hunters travel to Santiago on the southeastern coast of Cuba. This beautiful old city is bordered by the Sierra Maestra Mountains and the sea. Proud of its heritage as the cradle of the Castro Revolution, Santiago also played a pivotal role in the Spanish-American War. The crumbling old castles and fortresses that dot its shores once bristled with cannon and troops, for this was once the seat of Spain's strength during its colonial days. Negotiating permission to dive the wrecks was not easy. Relations between Cuba and the neighboring USA are thorny, to say the least. So the government in Havana guards its coastline carefully. Sea hunters John Davis, Mike Fletcher, and James Delgado joined their Cuban hosts on a survey of Santiago Harbor. The tropical beauty of the area adds to the pleasure of the journey.
That's where the Marina Cervera's fleet was anchored.
The American victors dubbed the 4-month-long Spanish-American War the Splendid Little War. But the battle was just one chapter of a conflict that had raged for decades, the struggle of the Cuban people to win freedom from Imperial Spain. Christopher Columbus claimed the island of Cuba for Spain in 1492. Sugar and tobacco trade made it an important port in Spain's far-flung empire. African and Cuban slaves, however, dreamed of freedom. Uprisings were frequent and brutally put down. Then, in 1895, Cuban journalist José Martí united the forces of Cuba Libre into a rebel army that was a match for the forces of Spain. Martí died early on in the revolt, a martyr to the cause of Cuban freedom. By 1898, the rebel force was gaining ground and appeared ready to expel the Spanish from Cuba. The revolution presented an opportunity for America to get involved. President William McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor, and the Spanish sent their battleship Vizcaya to New York. While at anchor, the Maine mysteriously blew up, killing 266 American sailors. American public opinion, egged on by the newspapers of the day, blamed the Spanish. Goaded by the chant, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," President McKinley ordered a naval blockade of Cuban ports. Spain responded with a declaration of war and promptly ordered a squadron of warships to embark for Cuba. 6 ships, led by Admiral Pascual Cervera, crossed the Atlantic and made for the port city of Santiago de Cuba. 2 squadrons of America's new and untried navy blockaded the harbor entrance, trapping the Spanish squadron inside. During 6 weeks of stalemate in the harbor, the U.S. Army was making its way to the very doorsteps of Santiago. On June 22, 1898, American troops were landed on Daiquiri Beach, just east of Santiago. It had been secured by Cuban forces, led by General Calixto Garcia. From there, they fought their way west to Spain's primary stronghold outside of Santiago, San Juan Hill. It was here that Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders made their famous charge. And here, U.S. and Cuban troops captured the highlands overlooking Santiago Harbor. This put the trapped Spanish fleet in range of American artillery. Admiral Cervera was ordered to take desperate action. He was to steam his fleet out of the harbor and directly into the teeth of the blockading American battleships. The epic sea battle that unfolded would shatter Spain's empire and forever alter the global balance of power. team arrives at their first site, the wreck of the Oquendo, over 30 kilometers west of Santiago de Cuba. The lonely cannon pointing skyward is a spire marking a final resting place for the Spanish colonial empire. This will be the first of 3 wreck sites the team will dive. These wrecks are not just relics of the Battle of Santiago. They also represent a massive change in Spain's relationship with the world and the rise of America as a new imperial power whose influence over the globe would prove to be unprecedented. More than simply a shipwreck, the Almirante Oquendo is also a memorial to the bravery and tenacity of the 80 Spanish sailors killed in the Battle of Santiago. The Almirante Oquendo was an armed cruiser built in 1891. She was the last cruiser out of the harbor when Admiral Cervera made his desperate run, and the second to be destroyed. According to naval records, she was hit up to 68 times by cannon fire from the American vessels Indiana, Iowa, Texas, and Oregon.
It was very exciting to swim through the wreckage of these turn-of-the-century pre-dreadnought battleships, because very few of these vessels have survived. And here, lying on the bottom, was an opportunity to look at a series of these wrecks that had literally been opened up by both battle and the effects of the sea, to give us an almost forensic sense, through a dissection, of what these vessels were like. From the machinery, to the turrets and the guns, to the armor plate. All of this was a rare and unique chance to learn more about a now vanished type of warship.
After the Oquendo, the next victims of the waiting American fleet were 2 Spanish destroyers, the Pluton and Führer. In rapid succession, both were annihilated by American shellfire. The battle had been raging for just over an hour, and only 2 of Cervera's fleet were still afloat, the Cristobal Colon and the Vizcaya. Vizcaya was the Spanish vessel that was ordered to New York as a counterpoint to the Maine's arrival in Havana. She was at anchor there when word of the Maine explosion reached America. Vizcaya was branded a threat to the city by the local press, and she left for Havana on February 24th. During the July 3rd Battle of Santiago, on her fateful escape from the harbor entrance, she was hit by nearly every U.S. ship. She was burning fiercely and exploded shortly after 11:15 a.m.
You're struck with the amount of current that exists at Vizcaya, because it too is shallow. And remembering the pictures of Vizcaya that were taken after she had wrecked, I recalled that she was standing proud out of the water. So you can imagine that same wreck now 100 years later, after hurricanes have beaten and battered it. Jim found a very large gun, still intact with its protective armor shell. And I could see that he was trying to get inside. And he finally did find a spot where he could just squeeze through. And it was a matter of timing. The small aperture causes the current to move in and out of the gun really, really fast. So you really have to time it just right. But once you are inside, it was like being in a really large room with far less current. Around the outside of the armor plate were a series of portholes, and it would have been from this position that perhaps a lone or a team of Spanish gunners would have poised their guns and aimed them back at the American fleet to return fire.
While the Vizcaya lay burning on the shore, the Cristobal Colon was the last ship afloat and was being furiously pursued by the American fleet. She was the newest of Spain's vessels, so new, in fact, that she had not yet had her main armament installed before being called to war. She had burned through her top-grade coal, leaving her only with inferior local coal, which cut her speed. The battleship of Oregon overtook her, and she veered along the shoreline. Oregon fired a 33-centimeter shell, which landed in front of her, and then another which landed just shy of the stern. Realizing there was no hope, the commander of the Colon hauled down her colors, opened her sea valves, and ran the ship aground. The sheer volume of the U.S. fleet's firepower proved enough to completely destroy the pride of Spain's navy. The Battle of Santiago was over.
Rolling off the back of the dive boat and dropping on down to the wreck of Colón, you're struck with how big it is on the bottom, particularly as you approach that massive bow with its huge ram in front of it. It dwarfs you, and you really get a sense of this warship. As we left the massive bow of Cristobal Colón and moved across the bottom, we approached a large hole in the side of the ship. Looking at the side, into what appeared to be a shell handling room for Colón's guns, I could see empty racks where shells had once lined the walls. I could see equipment discarded in the silt. All evidence of the last moments when those shells had been hastily sent up the decks to fire back at the American fleet. Looking up from the hull, you could see the guns lining the side of the vessel. And as we floated past them, you could see that these 57mm guns, Colón's secondary armament, were among the only weapons that the Spaniards had that day to fire back, because Colón's main battery had never been installed in the turrets. All a reminder, as we swam along the hull, of why Cervera had written to his superiors on the eve of the fleet's departure for Cuba, noting that he and his men sailed off to a sacrifice.
Colón offered the luxury of diving in calm water. Of the 3 wrecks that we had dove on in Cuba, she was by far the deepest, and as a result, she wasn't plagued by the surge of water as the ebb and flow of the groundswell moved in and out. So much of the structure of the ship survives, allowing us to swim through one deck level after another.
In examining these shell-ravaged hulls, we learn not only about the individual ships, but the conditions in which the crew struggled, fought, and died at a time when the world was changing dramatically, and the balance of power was shifting from the old world to the new. The sinking of the Spanish fleet may have been avoided had an unassuming American coal ship been successful in carrying out an audacious plan. The end of May 1898 found U.S. Admiral Sampson with every major American warship in the Atlantic encircling the mouth of Santiago Harbor. Sampson realized that while he could not get into the harbor to destroy the Spanish fleet, he could render it useless. If he could block the narrow channel at the entrance of the harbor, the Spanish fleet would be trapped and neutralized as a threat. This could be achieved by scuttling a ship across the narrowest point of the channel. The coal carrier Merrimac was designated expendable and selected for the mission. Sampson assigned the design of the operation to a 28-year-old naval engineer, Lieutenant Richmond Hobson. Hobson devised a plan which would require nerves of steel and split-second timing. Under the cover of darkness, the Merrimac would steam past the harbor defenses to the point where the channel narrowed to 106 meters. Here, they would swing across the 100-meter length of the Merrimac across the channel and detonate 10 massive charges. The explosion would demolish Merrimac's hull and sink the ship. Hobson knew that the chances of survival were slight. Nevertheless, a call for volunteers received a flood of offers. 6 men were selected, and the preparations began. This was a voyage where all aboard knew that if they returned at all, it would not be with the Merrimac.
Critical factors on this wreck site are clearly the forensic diagnostic information that's going to allow Jim to make a definitive declaration about who this wreck is. We can be quite certain it's Merrimac.
Our Cuban hosts certainly feel that it is, but there really has not been anyone who's had the opportunity to get down to the site and gather the information that allows them to make a definitive statement about this wreck.
The Cubans know there is a shipwreck located where history states the Merrimac went down. The sea hunters plan to dive the wreck and determine if it is indeed the doomed collier. Samples of coal will be retrieved, tested, and compared with U.S. Navy records. The team hopes that this evidence, combined with Jim's forensic observations on the bottom, will lead to a positive identification of this historic and heroic vessel. In the wee hours of June 3, 1898, under cover of darkness, Hobson and his men set out to fulfill their plan. They were piloting a floating bomb, lined with explosives and still carrying tons of coal. With the moon high in the sky, Hobson steered directly for Morro Castle on the starboard shore. As the Merrimac crept closer to the Channel Narrows, suddenly, from the shadows along the shore, a flash cut the darkness and a shell steamed over Merrimac's stern. A Spanish picket boat had opened up at point-blank range with its rapid gunfire. This alerted the batteries along the shore. Soon the Merrimac was in the midst of lethal crossfire. At a critical moment, Merrimac's steering gear was shot off by a Spanish shell. Immediately, Hobson ordered the bow anchor dropped, the signal for detonating the powder. But instead of the giant blasts that were expected, the cliffs echoed with just 2 small explosions. 8 of the 10 charges had failed to explode. Their firing mechanisms had been shot off. Instead of swerving across the channel, the Merrimac was carried further into the harbor. This put her in the crosshairs of 2 warships, which joined in the firestorm. Hobson and his men huddled on the deck as all around them shells and bullets raked the ship. Fire and steam from the blasted boilers hissed and crackled around them. Finally, the bow slipped beneath the surface as the stern rose above the swells. The crew found themselves in the dark water, clinging to wreckage as the Merrimac dropped to the bottom. When morning's light broke, Hobson and his men, clinging to their overturned raft, were picked up and brought here to the castle of El Morro.
In 1898, this was the principal fortification defending the harbor, and its guns opened fire on the Merrimac as she came in to block the channel and helped sink her. This same fort served as the prison for Hobson and his men. It's said that in the morning, they watched a small boat come by. It was a launch going to one of the Spanish ships, and Hobson reportedly yells out, "Is there an officer aboard who will take our surrender?" The answer was yes, and as the story goes, the officer was none other than Admiral Cervera himself. And he looks at the men in the water, he looks at the guns of the fort, he knows what's happened, he's seen this all unfold the previous night. He looks down at these guys, he says one word: valiente, valiant, brave. They fought to a code, they fought with chivalry. And the Spaniards respected them, even though they were adversaries. So while this prison seems grim, these guys were well treated, and ultimately they were transferred from this prison to more comfortable quarters in Santiago itself, and from there they were exchanged for Spanish prisoners of war.
All of the volunteers would return to the USA and later be awarded the U.S. military's highest award for courage under fire, the Medal of Honor. It may be the only incident in U.S. history where a vessel's entire crew received the declaration. With the gear checked and ready, John logs the time as the team starts their descent. It will now be up to James Delgado, the team's marine archaeologist, to positively identify this vessel and to once and for all put to rest the uncertainty of Merrimac's final resting place.
When we dropped into the water was murky and dark, and I was convinced we weren't going to find much of anything, that we'd be groping in the darkness, in the mud for fragments. And then, suddenly, out of the gloom appeared the stern, remarkably intact but also battle damaged, and that was exciting. Because the rudder off to one side reminded me of Hobson's account of how, as Merrimac entered the channel, her steering had been shot away. But even more exciting was the discovery that the top blade of the propeller was gone, seemingly shot away. We hadn't expected to see something this intact, and I hadn't expected to see something that was so clearly identifiable as Merrimac. Cargo hatches dropping into the interior, coal scuttles through which coal would have been passed, and shell holes in the sides and in the decks. The coal inside her holds had to have been set ablaze by all the gunshots, and she'd burned for some time. Her decks had to have been white hot to get twisted the way they were, and only when the ship sank were those fires put out. What was also exciting, though, was of course being able to do science and to reach into one of the holes, into the coal hold, and to retrieve pieces of coal to take back to the laboratory for analysis.
As we moved forward, at the very tip of the bow, bent and twisted and lying in the mud, Mike and I dropped on down, and Mike flashed the camera down, and at the same time my flashlight hit anchor chain coming out and dropping down into the mud. And as I moved along and turned, there, sticking out of the mud, was the shank of the anchor. The ship sank at anchor. At that stage of the game, for me, there was no doubt. I had a ship loaded with coal, shot full of holes, that had burned intensely, that had sunk in the channel at the exact spot where the charts say she should be. And it's a riveted steel ship that's deep draft and strong. It was Merrimac.
Later analysis of the coal sample results in more surprising news. The technicians announced that this coal had been exposed to heat intense enough to transform it into coke. For this transformation to have occurred, the coal must have been superheated, then suddenly quenched. For the sea hunters, this is further evidence that the wreck is that of the collier Merrimac, a ship that was set afire by thousands of rounds of enemy gunfire and burned ferociously before it and its cargo of coal plunged beneath the waves. The wrecks of the Spanish-American War are a few last relics of a battle to maintain the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. Their destruction, however, did not lead to a free Cuba. This great battle marked the beginning of American expansionism off the North American continent and the creation of a new American empire. Under the terms of the peace treaty, the U.S. took possession of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico for the paltry sum of $20 million. Within a year, the U.S. installed a military government in Cuba. What was a 4-month adventure for the USA was a bitter end to decades of struggle for the Cuban army. None of us thought, wrote famed revolutionary Cuban General Maximo Gomez, that the U.S. intervention would be followed by a military occupation of the country by our allies. This cannot be the ultimate fate after years of struggle. The Cubans did not forget the broken promises, nor did they give up their dream of Cuba free from foreign control. 60 years later, this dream would spark another revolution. History would not repeat itself. This time, when the smoke cleared, only the Cuban flag would fly over the island of Cuba.